welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode, where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1957 epic, The Bridge on the River Kwai. The film is set in a British prisoner of war camp deep in the jungle in 1943. New prisoners arrive in the camp whistling a happy tune as they march into captivity, unaware as to what lies before them. What lies before them, of course, is the construction or forced construction of the Burma Railway and a bridge over the aforementioned River Kwai, led by a rigid and upper-crust commanding officer named Colonel Nicholson and one lone American named Shears. The POWs and their staunch commander endure much as they attempt to build a rail bridge in the middle of the jungle. Bridge on the River Kwai stars William Holden as Commander Shears, Alec Guinness as Lieutenant Commander Nicholson, Jack Hawkins as Major Warden, Sesshu Hayakawa as Colonel Saito, James Donald, Jeffrey Horn, and many more. Kwai was directed by David Lean, produced by Sam Spiegel, and written by Carl Foreman and Michael Wilson, based on the book of the same title written by former POW Pierre Buell. The film was widely praised, winning several Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Alec Guinness, Best Screenplay, Editing, Music, and Cinematography.
About 18 months on the Death Railway, we named it, which was all it was, death galore. They haven't found some of the bodies yet. None of the people that lived there, that inhabited the natives, they just didn't have any records or where they put them. They just took them out to the jungle and buried them. That was the end of it. They didn't even know where they were buried. So nobody knows how many hundreds of thousands they killed there, but plenty.
That was the voice of Alois Kopp. Mr. Kopp served aboard the USS Houston and later worked on the Burma-Thai Railroad that was depicted in the bridge on the River Kwai. We'll hear more from him later on. One could argue that the star of the movie, Bridge on the River Kwai, isn't the actors, but the railway, and specifically the bridge. While the book written by Pierre Buell is fiction, as is the movie, the Burma-Thai Railway was a very real thing indeed. The railway was constructed during 1942 and 43. Reason for being built in the first place was so that the Japanese could supply their army through the jungle as opposed to going around by sea, thus saving them both mileage and precious time. Once completed, the rail line connected Bangkok all the way to Rangoon, now called Yangon. The idea of the railway running through the jungle connecting these areas was not a new one. The British themselves had originally come up with the same plan back in 1885. But with the equipment of the time, or rather the lack of equipment at the time, it was decided because of the terrain that it would be far too difficult to get done. Fast forward 57 years to 1942. The Japanese invade Burma, and after capturing the area, needed to keep their people supplied. As a side note, this was a recurring problem for the Japanese all across the Pacific. That is, the idea of keeping their people and bases well supplied. Japan occupied an area 5 times that size of Nazi Germany, and the vast majority of that territory was surrounded by water. The United States knew this, of course, and our submarines, and later our Pacific Fleet, would render that task all but impossible. But back to the bridge on the River Kwai. Before the railway was built, the route to supply Burma was clear around the Malay Peninsula, a route that put the Japanese transport at risk from, wait for it, American submarines. In order to avoid that threat altogether, the idea of building a rail line popped back up. As it stood, there would be a rail line of approximately 283 miles, 69 of which would be in Burma, and the remainder would lay in Thailand. Much of the route would be hacked out of the jungle, through mountain passes and over rivers. Now, the movie focuses on one bridge specifically, but there were actually over 600 bridges that were built across rivers as part of the Burma-Thai Railway. 600 bridges, over 200 miles. Once completed in December 1943, the rail line did exactly what the Japanese hoped it would do. Japanese were able to move over 500,000 tons of supplies down the railway before it fell into Allied hands in 1945. Now, back in 1942, knowing that the construction of the railway would be a laborious task to say the least and would absorb hundreds, if not thousands, of Japanese workers in the process, the Japanese decided to use forced labor to construct the rail line. Local population and prisoners of war would play the role of railroad workers. That being said, over 12,000 Japanese would work on the line, including conscripted Koreans. These people would mainly act as guards, engineers, and supervisors and not do actually any physical labor whatsoever. The physical labor would be done by prisoners of war that is, and locals, as I stated. It's estimated that over 180,000 civilians worked on the rail line from its inception until it was completed. It's unfortunate, though, that the number of civilians who died during the construction isn't really known. There's estimates that vary from 30,000 to over 100,000 civilians who died. Nobody will ever know. Their fate was not much better than those of the prisoners of war that toiled on the railway alongside them. The prisoners, which were the first to work, were roughly 3,000 British from Singapore, who were later met by Australians, also from Singapore. A total of roughly 60,000 prisoners of war would work on the railway from the beginning to the end. Americans were few in number when compared to their British and Australian comrades, but numbers are estimated to have been around about 600 or so. Like the fictional Commander Shears, played by William Holden in the movie, hundreds of those Americans came from the sunken heavy cruiser USS Houston, CA-30. The Houston was a Northampton-class heavy cruiser launched in 1929. She served extensively in the Atlantic in the late 20s and early 30s before moving to the Pacific in 1931, becoming the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. When war broke out with Japan in 1941, Houston was at the front of the fight. She engaged the Japanese at Macassar Straits and Java Sea in February 1942, and it was during the Battle for Sunda Strait on February 28, 1942, that she was fatally struck by a torpedo and enemy gunfire. Sinking rapidly, what remained of her crew was forced to abandon ship. 368 American sailors and Marines floated nearby when they were soon picked up by Japanese ships and made prisoners of war. One of those prisoners was a young man named Howard Brooks. Mr. Brooks served aboard Houston as an electrician's mate, and along with his surviving comrades, escaped his sinking ship late on the night of February 28th, only to be picked up by his enemy. After a long route that included a prison, a hell ship, and a train ride in hideously cramped boxcars, Brooks and his comrades arrived in Burma to begin work on the railroad. Let's listen as the Greenville, Tennessee native tells us about work on the railroad and the tropical diseases that plagued the prisoners.
And we could see there they had started the construction of this railroad. And that is where I first contact with the railroad. And he says, well, that's the end of our vacation place. This is it. Now, also, there were a lot of British guys along with us too on the ship, but they kept us separate in groups until we went to work on the railroad. We all worked together as one big group. But it became an everyday thing. We would work in an area and we'd say march up to 10 or 15 kilometers to the work site. And after you'd finish that work site, then you would be moved. Your camp would be moved. And you would maybe move over 2 camps, or over 1 camp, or 3 camps, whatever. But you would move on down the railroad, as you finished. Now, there would be crews making the fill, just digging the dirt, making it level. And then there would be a crew come along breaking up stone and putting the stone ballast on top of the fill. And then after that, they would bring in railroad ties. And then there'd be crews that laid the railroad ties. And then the final crew laying down the track. Now, we were all right, the first several days, but guys, didn't take long, began to come down with malaria, or you'd get a nick in your flesh, and it would develop into a tropical ulcer. Well, they had a little bit of stuff to start with, but it wasn't enough. Soon the time came when a guy would come down with malaria, you would pass out on the job. You would be working. Well, that was common, and that was nothing, because that's the way malaria is. Another thing with dysentery, because we had our mess kits. All the Army had their mess kits, but us sailors had whatever we could find that we had picked up along the way. to eat out of. But after you ate, they boil water in a 50-gallon drum. And we would stick our muskets in that. But after you take them out, you had nothing, unless you had something to cover them up with. Flies were every place. And so many guys got dysentery. We had one medical officer with us. It was Commander Epstein. He was our ship's surgeon. And he would say, well, look, this is all I have for now. We had charcoal, and he'd give us spoons full of charcoal, and it was hard to swallow. So you'd take a spoonful of charcoal, pulverized real fine, and you had to keep drinking water to get it down.
Tropical diseases were rampant among the POWs. Their ever-weakened physical state, lack of proper medicine, almost no hygiene, and mistreatment did not allow their bodies to fight off the infections that took hold of the men. Food was scarce, to say the least. Medicine and proper care were virtually non-existent. However, sick or not, the men were expected to work every day, regardless of their physical condition. Refusal to work resulted in a beating at best, death or torture at worst. Like the vast majority of prisoners of the Japanese, the POWs on the Burma-Thai Railway were subject to incredible mistreatment at the hands of their guards. Alois Kopp, whom we heard from earlier, was a German immigrant from North Dakota. He enlisted in the Navy in 1937 and went aboard the USS Houston as a pharmacist mate second class. In the following oral history clip, we'll hear how the POWs, mainly Kopp himself, were mistreated by their guards along the Burma-Thai Railway.
River Kwai. I was on the River Kwai, the biggest farce you ever saw when they made the movie. There was nothing real about it. Like I said earlier, we didn't have William Holden come in there and save the day. But afterwards I got severely beaten twice. That was for no reason. I was looking for food, and we'd barter with the natives, and they gave us 2 times. They issued us clothes, pair of shorts. But they were for the Dutch Indonesian army, and they're all small statured people. And we couldn't even, as bony as we were getting, we couldn't even get them on. So we'd take them and go out to the natives over the barbed wire fence, and we'd trade them for food. And that was a cardinal sin. They caught me doing it, and they just beat the holy bejeepers out of me. And I passed out. The guys were hollering, "Come on, cop, you can take it." Tell them to kick you in the groin and stuff like that. Silly stuff to give you some gumption. The bad things that the guys did was, one bad thing was they had absolutely forbidden to have a radio to get any news. But Americans being Americans, Americans are resourceful people. They stole enough equipment and took radios were made of tubes and condensers, and that was about all there was to it. So they could get some tubes and condensers. They made a radio. That was a death offense, and some guys got caught once, and they killed them. They chopped their heads off. We had people that first of all, first thing in the morning, the guards would come around and decide who has to work. And they paid no attention to the doctors. In fact, they beat on the doctors. If the doctor said, "This man can't work, I haven't got a thermometer to know what temperature it is, but I know he's having a high temperature, and he'll die if we send him out." They'd beat up the officers. "Oh, our officers I got beat for that reason." I told him one day, I said, "This guy can't go out on anything." The guy beat the hell out of me. He just hit me all over until I said, "Well, you must take him out. You take him out, but he'll die on the way." Then he left. He didn't take the guy out, but he got his beating in on me. Another time I brushed my teeth with this charcoal and used toothbrush, and we had to salute them every time they walked by. If you walked by them 100 times in camp a day, you saluted them 100 times. If you didn't, pow, they beat you up. And Sometimes they used the rifle butt to do it. They did it on me because I didn't salute the guy. I was brushing my choppers with this stuff, and I had so little water I had to preserve it, and that charcoal is pretty mean. It's all black. And I was spitting it on the ground. There's no sanitation there, just right on the ground. And I looked up under a bamboo tree a little ahead of me, and I saw these puttees and Japanese shoes. And then I looked up further, and I could see more of a guard standing there, and I hadn't saluted him. I didn't see him. He come over and he says, "You no salute." And he hauled up with his fist, and I was a foot taller than he was, maybe more. And I just reared back like a guy will do to defend yourself. And he missed me about so far, but in the process, he had his bayoneted rifle, and he darn near impaled himself. It went through his shirt, and, and he missed impaling himself, and then he was like a hornet. Then he got up and he took the rifle and he punched me on the stomach with a rifle butt, and then he stomped me. And good thing he had on rubber shoes. They had no leather shoes, they had rubber shoes. And they saved the day. Oh, I was awful sore for a day, so he kicked me in the ribs. I passed out, and I got 2 of those.
The forced construction of the railway was considered a war crime by Japan. This was because of the conditions, mistreatment, and deaths incurred while using forced labor. It is estimated that 13,000 Allied prisoners of war died or were murdered during the construction of the Railway of Death. Following the war, those in charge were tried for their war crimes. 32 Japanese were sentenced to death. However, none of the sentences were carried out. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the 2004 film Downfall. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.